Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows. One of the joys of my part-time news job is that right in the middle of the shift, I get to do a newscast for a guy named Rich Gilgallon. He does a talk show, and it's not a quiet one. He rants and raves and yells, but you know, it's all in good fun because Rich knows what he's talking about. He should. He's had one of the most varied careers in and out of broadcasting that you'd ever want to hear about. And that's what we're going to hear this week. Rich, thanks for taking the time to join us. You have an interesting kind of mixed accent. Where did you grow up?
The beautiful coal mining city of Scranton, Pennsylvania. My father was my father's father was a breaker boy. He was in the mines when he was 9 years old. As you know, Dennis, the coal carts that would go down into the mines, they would fill them up to the top, in fact, pile them up. And when they would come back up the track, they would, many of the pieces would fall off the coal wagon and they would fall between the tracks. And a man's hand could not fit between those tracks. So they hired 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids.
Hoping that a car wouldn't come by.
Oftentimes it did, Dennis, sadly. In fact, I've done a lot of research on what it was like in those days. And if you go back and look, you'll see that every day somebody died in the coal mines in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So he did that from the time he was 9 until he was 59. And my father was a computer engineer in the 50s.
Wow.
He was one of the first guys really that would be called a computer engineer. His first job where he took the family was to he worked for National Cash Register, and they actually put the first computer into Macy's in New York City, in Manhattan, and that was his job there for some time. So we moved to New Jersey after Scranton.
Well, you know, National Cash Register, with IBM, were probably two of the really innovative early companies.
They were the two.
And I remember they had then no carbon required paper, which was also NCR, if you remember that.
Well, they were the two big ones in those days. National Cash Register was centered out of Dayton, Ohio, and so we spent a little time there. And you know, it was an amazing time growing up in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, where I learned how to talk. Then.
Yes, I was going to ask about that.
First grade through sixth grade. Went to New Jersey schools, and then we moved to Boston.
I didn't ask you about that.
No, you didn't ask me, but I felt like I should tell you anyway. Then we moved to Boston when I was 12, and I was there until I went to Washington in 1980.
Getting back to mining for a second, I am from a part of Indiana where there was a lot of coal mining. As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful story. They didn't know there was coal under my hometown until they put the B&O Railroad through, and they had to cut a V through a hill to keep the railroad level. Because unlike a highway where you can go up and down, trains have to stay very, very on a constant grade. They found coal digging for the railroad.
Isn't that amazing?
But you read about that and you see those documentaries and you think, I mean, coal was as necessary then as oil is now.
Well,
it's actually that necessary.
It's actually that necessary now.
You didn't know if you were coming up that night.
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting. You would drive downtown Scranton from where I lived on the west side, and you'd go by an 8-story building. And when you came back, it was a 6-story building.
Because of subsidence?
Yes, the ground would open up every now and then, and buildings would just disappear. But I grew up in a time where we lined our Little League field with coal ash. It was my job to get up in the morning and stoke the fire. I'm not young. I remember very vividly getting up at 5 in the morning, going down to put coal on the fire and to empty the ash cans. You know, so.
Well, you say the word coal chute to somebody today.
Yeah, they don't know.
Not everybody's going to know what the heck you're talking about.
And the coal train, you know, when the coal train operator would blow the whistle as he approached the city limits of Scranton. And the reason they blew that whistle was so that the women could go out and pull the laundry off the line. so that it wouldn't get all sooted up as the train went by. So they gave him fair warning to go out and pull the clothes off the clothesline.
I often wondered in steel mill cities such as was Allentown a steel
Allentown,
mill? And
Pittsburgh, primarily.
During the war, when they were operating 7 days a week, how the women ever hung their clothes outside.
Well, yeah, they did anyhow. You
Yeah.
know, but it was just one of the things they had to get used to in those days. We're pretty spoiled these days with everybody has a washer and a dryer in the house.
Now, you say you grew up there, Scranton, and then you moved, and then again you ended up in Boston.
Ended up outside of Boston in Framingham, Massachusetts.
How old were you then?
I was 12, when I got there in '66, and then my father worked for Honeywell and some of those other computer companies up there. So I went to high school there. Was lucky enough to be the elected senior class president, and then in 1973, the first year that you could vote. Actually, 1972, the first year you could vote as an 18-year-old, and I ran for local office as a park commissioner of the town of Framingham against two guys that had been in there for about 15 years, 20 years, and beat them.
Really?
Door to door as an 18-year-old.
You weren't very 18-year-old.
I was 18.
Yes, okay.
I went to the town clerk's office. His name was Mike Ward. Tell you how long ago it was. He was smoking a cigar inside the office, which I know you would have loved.
Yeah, a new broom sweeps clean.
And he says, I said, hey, if you can vote at 18, can you run for something? He says, well, yeah, I don't see why not. What do you want to run for? I go, I don't know. What do you got? So he laid out all the offices that were electable, and there was one called Park Commissioner, and I thought I'd take a chance at that, and because I was very much into politics like you, and amazingly, I was elected. My mother said, now don't get your hopes up. That was my mother, don't get your hopes up. You're asking too much. And, we did it the right way. I grew up, my grandmother was the Democratic chairwoman for Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania, so I was familiar with election days. I was familiar with campaign organization at a very, very young age. I worked for guys that were running for governor when I was 14. I marched in a parade with Mike Dukakis, I think, when I was 14. I worked for Kevin White, all the liberals up there when I was a kid. So, and then one thing led to another. I was working in the Framingham incinerator, a garbage dump, and wound up Father Drinan. I
Robert,
know you remember.
The congressman, eventually.
The Jesuit congressman was told by the Pope that he had to leave Congress. He couldn't no longer serve in Congress as a Jesuit priest. And so he retired, and about 20 people ran for that seat. And a friend of mine was a friend of a guy who happened to be running, and so I helped that guy, and he wound up getting elected. And I was a Friday in the Framingham incinerator and Monday in the halls of Congress.
Wow.
And that was Barney Frank, of course.
Wow, absolutely. So did you then stay in Washington?
I did, yeah.
That's what brought you to D.C.
Yeah, it brought me to D.C. I left the incinerator, packed up.
And went into another one.
And went into where real garbage was stirred. And initially I went down as an LBJ intern. And I split that with a guy named Will Brownsberger, who was a Harvard lawyer. So it was a Harvard lawyer and an incinerator attendant that split the LBJ intern grant.
I remember the first time I sat in on a Commerce Committee hearing. I'm looking around, and I can't remember all the names now, but I'm seeing all of these congressmen I'd seen on television and heard about, and I was kind of a groupie. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was really in awe of the legislative process, but the other thing is how much time it takes to get anything done. Oh, yeah. You would sit in a congressional hearing and have to leave and make a car payment. I mean, it was really deadly something.
I was just going to say, particularly in the House, where you have 435 members, and if you're in the Commerce Committee meeting, there's probably 60 members of that committee.
There were two tiers of chairs.
So I mean, the work gets done primarily in the House in subcommittees, where you have like 12 or 13. It's a little more manageable. The committee work is generally just to process what takes place in the subcommittees.
So after a while on Capitol Hill, you're among all these movers and shakers, but it just doesn't feel right. You go into private business, into the restaurant
I
business.
do, yeah. I was proud to be a bartender. In
But
fact,
it's not an easy job.
No, I think I was one of the best bartenders in Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and then I wound up going up to Northwest Washington to Chadwick's, which was the bar that just happened to be located, in the middle of Media Central, where all the TV and radio stations would gather. And it was just a stroke of luck, really, that I just happened to be there. And I got sober around that time. Around 1985 in April, I quit drinking.
But how can you be a bartender and quit drinking?
Well,
Wasn't that
I
a pretty
found
tough
it.
assignment?
I found it easier to look out rather than looking in.
Okay.
Nobody thought I was going to quit. I mean, I was not a light case, and I had a little Oriole calendar by the cash register, and every day I came in and took a magic marker and crossed off one day, and then before you knew it, it was, the end of the season, and then before you knew it, it was a year, and then it was 10 years. And
so it was a
20
lot of
years.
1 days at a time.
It was a lot of 1 days at a time, so that cleared my head up a lot, and, and I just from working in the restaurant business, just happened to be attending bar one day when the general manager, Frank Byrne from WMZQ, was a customer. And I just overheard him tell Jim London, who was the famous morning guy, Jim London and Mary Ball, an amazing country music team in Washington, D.C., just happened to overhear him say that the guy that was doing their Redskin reports, Jeff Bostic, had signed a deal with WMAL to switch stations. And I don't, to this day, Dennis, know what possessed me. I only can say it was God. I leaned over that bar, and I said to him, Frank, I could do that job. And he said, Rich, this is not Scranton. This is the number 6 market in the country. Give us 2 menus and 2 Heinekens, and then leave us alone. We're talking business. And there's the brush up.
Sure.
And I just went back and I said, Frank, I'm not in your office. You're in my office. In fact, you're sitting at my desk. This is 1987, 86. I said, nobody in the country has a fan's perspective. This is before ESPN. There was no sports radio. I said, you could be the first station in the country with a fan's perspective, and what better fan than a bartender? And I'm the best bartender in town, and what can I get you guys for lunch? About a couple of days later, this guy called me back.
Were you surprised?
I was shocked.
I would think so.
He said, Rich, I haven't slept in 2 nights since you talked to me. Come in and make a tape. We'll see what it sounds like. So I went in and made a tape with Jim London and Mary Ball. It was a great audition tape, and he called me that day, and he said, it sounds pretty good. I have to take it to Sumner Redstone, and nobody's ever done this.
Now, he was owner?
Sumner was the owner of MZQ. He owned Viacom.
Now, at this point, you mentioned, I don't want to lose people if they're not from D.C., you mentioned that Jeff Bostic had gone to WMAL, which, as sports at that time, they had the Redskins.
Yeah, they
were
carried
pretty
the team.
much the radio station.
Absolutely. That's why he went, sure.
And MZQ then was what?
Just the country station.
And about 4th in the market?
It's top 10.
Okay.
Always top 10. Now,
it was a very good station, but not at the top.
No, not at the top.
Yeah.
But
a potent FM signal.
Very big FM signal, 98.6 FM. And make a long story short, he called me after speaking to Sumner, and they decided to put me on Friday mornings and Monday mornings, previewing the weekend, and then
Monday morning
wrapping it up. 6:45 and 7:45, 2 3-minute segments. And I'll give you $300 cash. And I thought I died and went right to heaven. Because I had to work hard to make $300, Dennis.
Yeah.
As a bartender. That's 3 nights schlepping, Averaged about 100 a night, maybe behind the bar.
I had a friend who was a bartender in D.C. He said, you would think with all the wealth in this town, the tips would be higher.
No.
But they're not.
Well, it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah.
Bartending, people say, I'd like to be a bartender. I tell them, okay. Stand at your desk all day today. Don't do anything different. Do what you normally do at work, but do not sit down, not for a second, for your 9 hours on the job. And then if you can do that a couple days in a row, then maybe you'll have a chance. But, I couldn't believe it. Now, the amazing thing is that 3 days later, Frank Byrne who was the general manager of MZQ, was let go. And I have never seen or spoken to him again.
So he gets you in the door, and then he's out.
He's gone. And I didn't know any of the politics of the building at that time. So for 7 years, I closed Chadwick's at 3 a.m. on Thursday night and Sunday night. And then I drove to the studio at MZQ on Cleveland Circle there at like 3:35. Took a 2-hour nap on the couch in the Jock Lounge, where in those days everybody was smoking in the Jock Lounge.
Yeah.
And I wake up, take a big cup of coffee, and do my segments. And then one day, I said to MZQ, we had a different manager, obviously, at the time. I said, I've been doing this a long time for this 300. Do you think I can get another couple of hundred? And the guy said to me, it's not in the budget. I said, okay. 7 years. Well, that day I get a call from a guy named Scott Meyer, who was in Washington, D.C. at the behest of the Rails brothers that own half of Sears and Craftsman Tools. And they bought an AM station that was simulcasting classic music, and we're going to put the first sports station in Washington, D.C. He said, I heard your stuff this morning, and I want you to come down to the Occidental Hotel. Now, I got to work that night, Chadwick's. It's like a Friday. I said, all right. So I get a cab, and I take it to the Occidental. I got my Chadwick's tie on. And he says to me, I heard you this morning. I have an idea. I want you to be our afternoon drive talk show host on a new sports station in Washington, D.C., and I'll give you $60,000.
Oh, this would have been what year?
1992.
At that point, there were some sports stations around the country.
There were two. There were two.
I was going to say less than half a dozen.
Yeah, there was one in San Diego, and there was obviously the Fan in New York, and that was the only two sports stations in the country. And so this guy, in fact, is the guy that put together the Fan in New York. And so he said, I said, make it 80. He said, I'll give you 60. I said, make it 80. I didn't know. I thought that's what you were supposed to do,
It's a digger.
He said, I'll give you 70 and don't push it. I said, okay. And I never made 30, So I went back to MZQ and I said, these guys don't even know me. They don't know, how I am in the office or whatnot. They offered me 70, and they said, well, we'll match it. And I said, no, I think we'll let it go. And so this guy was going to be the general manager, Scott Meyer. Well, he had a falling out with the Rails brothers, apparently. And so he wound up not being the general manager. And so I never saw him or spoke to him again after I signed a deal.
You have this thing about people you signed contracts with.
I know people say that. I look upon it as miracles, as agents, angels.
Yes.
There are people that you'll come across. It could happen today, where you'll just bump into somebody and they'll say something, and the next thing you know, the course of your life is changed forever.
The first job I got in D.C., I will say this, I used to visit all the time because they had aunts and uncles out there, and they were pretty well off, and I didn't find out till after my dad died that my Uncle Austin, who was assistant head of the General Services Administration or something, had lived out there since the Depression. He was sending money back for my dad for gasoline and motel and everything to make it possible for his brother to come visit. Well, anyway, I had a friend at Associated Press Radio whom I had taught how to operate the control board when he was a student at the university in the town where I was working. And I went to visit AP Radio one night, and I'm getting ready to leave, and this guy rushes in, and just shouting profanities, and finally they said, Howard, what's wrong? And he said, our overnight anchor, his parents were killed in a car wreck. He gave us 3 days' notice. And I turned to the guy and said, what do you have to do? He said, well, you have to read for 6 hours and be fairly literate and be able to hit the clock. And
right up your alley, Dennis.
And I said, well, should I put, he said, well, here, tomorrow, I'm driving back to Indiana. We'll stop and leave a tape. So I stopped by the station, which was on the way out of town. And I walk in and I explain that this man, Howard Dykes, had said this. And the guy just goes over to the teletype and rips off a piece of paper, says, go in the room, I'm going to roll tape, you read it. It was about changes in the curia of the Catholic Church with all kinds of names that I could read with my eyes closed. I was really up to date on that. So I read it. Of course, back then I'm talking like this. You know, we all had that rock and roll.
Well, you have an amazing broadcast presence, Dennis.
Well, thank you. So, and I don't look like I sound, but neither one of us does. So anyway, I drive back to Indiana, and the phone rings. The guy said, "When can you come to work?" I did not have the guts to tell my dad how little he was offering me. But I came to D.C., and I would not have gotten that job if I had left 5 minutes earlier.
It's amazing.
I would probably never move there.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing, isn't it? It really is.
People have bad luck, people have good luck, but everyone I know in broadcasting got one or two jobs in the most incredibly haphazard way.
Oh, absolutely. It's
like you overhearing the guy at the bar.
Yeah, it's not what you know. Frank Burns said to me, "Do you have an education in broadcast journalism?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you have any experience?"
So no,
I said, "Well, no. No. I was, I mean, I've been in politics. I mean, I know how to talk. You know, and something I just knew. I had a sense that I would be really, really good at this, I probably think I'm better than a lot of ex-bosses think I am, but as you know, to survive in broadcasting for almost 30 years, you got to have a thick skin, and you got to be prepared to go wherever you have to go to follow the dream. So,
I remember being in a conversation sometime with someone about how the old phrase, "what goes around comes around." When I was at Indiana University, there were two guys who were thrown together in all kinds of projects who could not stand each other. And one of them was a very large guy. I'm not going to mention any names, but on the final day in senior year, we did live television newscasts. The other guy back in the control room put a crawl. Those are those words you see across the bottom. I'll call him the large guy, Mr. Tubb. Mr. Tubb's Wardrobe by Bloomington Tent and Awning.
Oh, killer.
Okay? Right. 15 years later, the guy who put the crawl gets a job with KCBS in San Francisco and walks in and finds out that Mr. Tubbs is his boss.
You never know.
Never burn any bridges.
Try not to burn bridges. It's not easy. Radio is extraordinarily confrontational inside the buildings. It's
almost shamefully so.
Sometimes I think so. Yeah. For example, if you're any good in a reasonably sized market, you're going to make more money than your program director or your boss. Mm-hmm. And that sets up a very strange dynamic.
Yes,
when a guy who is in charge is making less money than the guy who he's in charge of, it's a very strange situation. You don't find it in very many other businesses.
When I was at Mutual Broadcasting, I was a non-union director-producer. Back then, they would not let me touch a tape recorder.
Right.
The National Association of Broadcast Engineers and Technicians, engineers, did that. Mm-hmm. And if I did it, they'd file a grievance. Mm-hmm. They were making back then about $31 an hour under some circumstances, and I think I was making $12 or something. And you're right, there were times I had to lower the boom on these guys, and I felt like, where am I coming from? I'm just a peon here at the company. But it can create some really odd tensions between people.
And ego, of course, this is radio is an ego-driven business, obviously.
And I don't think we get enough praise. Now, my current news director, almost every morning, he thanks me for something I did the day before.
Right. Well, you
wouldn't get that a lot of places.
He's very special. Your news director is a very special guy.
But it's good. My guest this week is Rich Gilgallon, who, with me, works here in Palm Springs, California, and we have something else in common. We both worked for a long time in Washington, D.C. at the same time and did not meet each other until we both moved out here, but we have a lot of friends in common. We have gone through his career and his amazing accidental leap into broadcasting in D.C. How many years were you with that pioneer all-sports station?
We got hired by WTM in TEM. I got hired in February of '92, and the strange thing was, after this meeting with Scott Meyer, I went back to MZQ to inform them that
this was the station where you
I had
were
been
working.
With, yeah.
for 8 years.
And as I said, for 7 years,
7.
I told them these guys offered me $70,000 without even knowing who I was.
And they're paying you $300 a week.
Yeah, $300
right?
a week, and they offered to match it, which I turned them down. And so I told Scott Meyer that, and so they started paying me right away, which was an amazing blessing because we didn't go on the air till Memorial Day in May. And we went on the air. I went on the air with an unbelievable sports talk show called Kiley and the Coach. My partner was Kevin Kiley.
Kevin Kiley?
He was the sports guy in D.C. on Channel 7. He was also on Turner football coverage, did ESPN college football games. Very well known guy in the sports business. And
now, what hours were your shows?
Well, the lineup at WTEM was amazing. It started out with Paul Harris, who went on to KMOX in St. Louis, the long
and worked with Jack Buck there for a
outstanding
long
career.
Time.
And then we had Tony Kornheiser, who's still there, by the way.
Now, is he essentially a newspaper writer?
He was until we started on the radio. In fact, Tony and I had done a demo for WMAL maybe a year before we were both hired by WTEM.
So once he got the radio bug, bye-bye newspaper.
No, he still wrote for the Post for a long time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but he has since, I think, probably given that up. Because he went on to do Monday Night Football, which is the plum of all plums in our business. So we had James Brown, eloquent, wonderful human being from CBS television. He was on from noon to 2, and then Kiley and the Coach from 2 to 6. So it was a great lineup, and I never thought it would end. I thought it'd be good.
You had that afternoon drive, people going home, listening to you in the car.
And I was a whack job. I was like the number one Washington Redskin fan in the country. And I didn't care who knew about it. I had a sound effect. Every time the Dallas Cowboy fans would call, it would be like, ding, ding, spittoon. I had a great time. Kiley and I disagreed on almost everything. We argued pretty much straight for 4 hours a day. But we developed an amazing passion for the business and a love for each other that I think people saw through. And we actually, after we had left WTEM and went our separate ways, we were called by ESPN to do a week when Dan Patrick went on vacation just a few years ago. So we had a little reunion week, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great show. Unfortunately, the station decided to syndicate us, and there had never been a sports syndicated station ever. And so they hooked a deal up with Jones Intercable in Denver, and they started to syndicate us. In fact, we were on probably 120 stations, and one of those stations was out here in the Coachella Valley. So, the guys that were working there were a little miffed that they signed a contract to work for one station.
Right.
And so they wanted to renegotiate all the deals. Now, I, on the other hand, had never made this kind of dough,
No, you were thrilled.
I was like, I begged them,
this
please don't gum this up. Please, I'm begging you guys, listen, don't mess this up.
This beat shoveling ashes like crazy.
So they messed it up. And the station, my recollection of it was that they contacted Jones and asked them to help pay the salaries, and they said no. And so they said, okay, then syndicate this, and they fired everybody.
Wow.
It was a disaster.
What did it feel like to be part of a brand new radio station that hadn't gone on the air yet, to be there and give birth to it?
Well, it was really exciting, Dennis. I mean, I had done vignettes for 7 years. I mean, I had done editorials, written and read. This was a new challenge. This was straight talk, and so initially, I was probably a little green, So I had to work my way through that conversational stuff. And I just decided that we were overmanaged. Is that a surprise?
No, not at all.
I had program directors telling me, no, you got to talk like this, you got to talk like that. And finally I just said, you know what, I'll tell you what, I got a contract now. I've already signed a 2-year contract. So I'm going to do the way I want to do it. If I get fired for doing it the way I want to do it, I can live with that, Dennis. But if I try to conform to everything you are trying to make me be, and I get fired for that, I can't live with that. So, I had problems with the succession of program directors that were there because they didn't get me. I'm just a regular guy. I don't try to be anybody different.
And they're not used to that.
No, they're not.
I mean, so much of radio is facade.
Yeah, ESPN.
And there are so many people we know who are a completely different person off the air than they are on the air.
Very, very true. And
so don't have them change. That's what's making them the money.
Right. ESPN never got me. I've been through that building several times, but I did not fit their little cookie cutter image that they have. And you could see when you watch it. You have to be almost unfunny to be accepted as a member of that staff.
All those years when I was in D.C., I constantly put in applications to go to NPR because I was on the road every week, largely at my own expense, which is why I do not live in splendor now. But I kept getting these polite letters from NPR, and finally one of the people in hiring said, you're just a little rock and roll for us.
It's amazing.
And I suddenly realized they wanted that kind of college, low-key thing, even out on the road.
Well, see, that's the problem with our
Niagara
business.
Falls.
You're absolutely right. That's one of the problems with our business is program directors.
Yeah.
They have an ear for what they expect to hear.
And if they don't hear it in 4 seconds,
it kills them.
They shut the tape off.
It drives them crazy.
Yeah.
And a lot of great, talented people, never got the chance.
Well, the great story about broadcasting, and I do a speech about the history of radio, is when CBS sent Murrow to Europe in advance of the war because UP and AP wouldn't sell news to radio. They thought it was an inferior medium, so they said, go set up a news bureau. Somebody files a report back to New York from Austria when the Anschluss happened, when Hitler's moving in. Mm-hmm. And it was this incredible on-the-scene report, and the head of CBS, Bill Paley, wires Murrow back, said, this guy doesn't sound like an announcer. Mm. And Murrow wired back something to the point that, do you want someone who sounds like an announcer or someone who knows what's going on? And Paley issued a report just said touche. That was Eric Severide.
Yeah, well,
in the beginning,
and that's what got radio news really kicking in those days.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting. I had the occasion to get to know Paley Jr. In Washington D.C. And a very fascinating family. Fascinating family, and really, who knows where CBS would have been, without him.
For those who don't know, William Paley was essentially CBS. Mm-hmm. He was, you do it, you don't do it. If you saw that great movie, Good Night or Good Luck, about mm-hmm. Murrow, George Langella, Frank Langella played Paley, but he allowed people such as Orson Welles to be on the air with no sponsor. He would allow people whom he thought were creative, who had talent, and gave the kind of programming he thought CBS needed, whether he lost money on it or
not. It wasn't all about the dough.
No,
in
and
those
you
days.
Talk about that today, people go, you're out of your mind.
Yeah.
No pay, no play.
It's all about the dough today, brother. What I teach young people who want to get involved in radio is I try to have them to understand that much like the picture that you will look at that is a little girl picking flowers, and if you stare at it long enough, you see the dragon. Mm-hmm. Radio is similar in that what's important really is not what I do in the segments that I do it. What's important is the advertisement that comes in between my segments. In other words, the ads don't come in between my segments. I come in between the segments of ads. If you want to do private radio, for pay radio, then you got to have sponsors. And if you're going to be a talent, you're going to have to get actively involved and participate in not only the finding of those sponsors, but in the mollification of those sponsors.
Keep them happy.
Which is something I've always stressed.
I had a friend who managed a radio station, and he found out that the station, when it joined ABC Radio, signed on that it would carry all the sportscasts on weekends and never carried any. And he said, I talked to CBS, and I said to them, well, okay, well, I'll find a place for these. And he said, well, it'll really add something to our programming. And the woman on the other end of the phone said, we're not concerned about content. We're concerned about getting the commercials on.
Well, that's why.
And so it's a whole different mindset. He was thinking in terms of what it's going to do to make the station sound better, right. And all they wanted were their damn commercials on the air.
Well, you see, that's philosophically, I think I know a lot of great talent that failed in radio because they looked down their nose at the sales department. Okay? You have to work as a team, in my view, if you want to have a successful radio show. And you have to incorporate those sponsors. That's the blessing of amplitude modulated radio, is that you have the opportunity to schmooze up a client outside of the commercial.
Sure.
You can bring them on for a segment. You can have that conversation. It makes them feel very special. And, you get a chance to say thank you for spending your hard-earned money and promoting the show. And as you know, especially in conservative talk radio today, there's a little bit of a battle going on around the country from organizations that have been formed in order to get conservative talk off the air. And so they have little cabals where people call sponsors and harass them for advertising on the Rush Limbaugh show or the Rich Gilgallen show or what have you. And so that's why you have to, especially today, it's not just it's not like it was in the old days where you go into a restaurant and say, give me $100 and we'll talk about your restaurant. I mean, you have to have people that want to stand with you, especially in talk radio.
And advertisers are much more sophisticated than they used to be.
Absolutely.
But here again, they all like to hear their name on the air.
Of course they do. As do I, Dennis.
Oh, and so
as do you.
Now, is Rich Gilgallen your real name?
That's my actual birth name. Yes, it is.
Because mine is Dennis Daly. And everybody says, well, what's your real name? I said, well, Dennis Daly. Isn't that a radio name? I go, no.
Well, there was a guy in Washington, D.C. I'm trying to remember his name. He worked for Viacom. It might have been Fuddrucker, let's just say. It was Billy Fuddrucker. And they told him you couldn't go on the air with that name. And so he said, okay. And he went on with as Marty Fuddrucker, and really kind of bummed him out.
I had a friend whose news director was Bernard Broomhead, and I said, "What did he call himself on the air?" He said, "Bernie Broomhead."
Bernie Broomhead.
Absolutely.
Well, we've had Anita Mann.
Yeah.
We had her on the air for a while, and it's one of the interesting things about radio. But it's such a theater of the mind, is the saying. In Washington, D.C., there were some great DJs and voices. LBD and Wolfman Jack was there for a while towards the end of his career, and a bunch of other guys, Bob O'Brien. And I'm in a restaurant one day with a bunch of people, and a waiter comes up and he says, what'll it be? I said, I think I'll have the pot roast. And he said, oh, my gosh, I can't believe you're in our restaurant. We listen to you on the radio every single day. And so everybody at the table is paying attention, and my chest is puffing up a little bit. And I said, well, thank you. I'm so happy to hear that. And he yells back, Jimmy, LBD is here.
The wrong person.
I said, oh.
I was in a restaurant in D.C. one time, and I have a loud voice. And this guy at the next booth, I never understood the decorations, but he was military. He had scrambled eggs all over him, and epaulettes or whatever they call them. And he said, are you Dennis Daly? And I said, yes, I am. He said, well, I listen to you on Armed Forces Radio. And at that time I was doing overnights. I didn't always have prime time. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you must be one of the 5 or 6 people who were up at that time. He said, no. I'm in Tokyo. Said, you're doing the prime time news over
so
there.
You never know,
and I thought, wow, maybe somebody's hearing it out there.
You mentioned,
he certainly was.
And you mentioned NPR in Washington, D.C. They have the WAMU is the #1 station in town.
Yes, and that's American University.
It's American University. It plays,
go ahead.
It plays bluegrass primarily.
You wouldn't think so.
And gives you the news of the day, and with a couple of NPR type shows on it. So,
well, a mutual friend, or at least acquaintance of ours, Ed Walker, who was an announcer in D.C., born blind, and for years had a partner at night, Willard Scott. They
exactly
did the
right.
Joy Boys. Well, Ed and I did a show one time, and we're talking about the theater of the mind, and he does this thing where he says, now I'm going to go over here and get these books, bring them back.
Yeah.
And ruffling paper and everything, and then he has some cellophane. He starts coughing as if it's on fire. And he didn't move out of his chair, but it sounded as if he walked across the room and came back. And that is the great thing about radio.
Well, the great one.
We are what people think we are.
That's right. The greatest I ever saw, personally, was Doug Tracht, the Grease Man.
Mm-hmm.
He had, in those days, everything was on tracks, commercial, 8-track, and you would have a track machine, which would have, in most stations, you'd have one that had 3 tracks. It's pretty much all you'd need. He had like 5 of those 3-track machines piled on top of each other on both sides.
And each had a tape in them.
Yeah, and he would tell these amazing, convoluted, complex stories and be pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling and putting these 8 tracks in there. And that was a skill.
Some of those guys could play those machines as if they were typing.
It's true.
Or like playing
an
the
instrument.
organ.
Yeah,
absolutely.
He was the best. He was the best I ever saw.
Did you ever meet Nat Albright?
I can't think.
When I first went to D.C., there was this fellow, Nat Albright, who talked like this. He did recreated sports in the persona of what they did in the 30s, where the guy would sit there and he'd get the teletype, first inning, so-and-so
Right.
up, single.
That's what Ronald Reagan
That's what Ronald Reagan did. But if you like tennis, you could go to Nat and say, Nat, my boss is named Joe Betts, and I'd like for him to play Eli Nastasi. And he'd do a tape of this guy. Or if you're football, made a great amount of side money doing that.
Well, I grew up listening to Great Talk Radio in Boston.
WBZ?
WBZ, 254-5678. This is the Larry Glick Show. Larry
We could
Glick.
do an hour
Yeah,
on Larry Glick, who was an overnight wacko.
Amazing talk radio. And I worked the third shift for years. And so I really learned an awful lot about what it takes to be a radio personality from listening to Larry Glick and Guy Manila and those great guys. And Kenny Beatrice, and I got to give him some credit, too, down there at WMAL, did sports talk before anybody else did. It's not heavy lifting,
But you have to enjoy it. When radio ceases to be fun, get out.
Oh, you'll know
I'm
it right
doing
away.
4 hours a day now, and at my age, I don't think I want to do 5 or 6. 4 is fine, and you're doing 2.
I'm doing 2, but I'd love to do 4.
Okay.
But they won't give them to me, so
Maybe
I'll
it could
take
work.
my 2.
I have 2 quick questions.
Yeah.
Do older people call you Kilgallen?
Well, yes, they do because of Dorothy, and in fact, my name gets butchered: Gaggalin, Gogolin, Gilligan, Galgolian, Gilgallian, Gil first name, Gallon last name, but they do, and my family's always had a soft spot in our heart for Dorothy Kilgallen, who, frankly, I believe was tragically murdered by someone in our own government
She
to
knew
keep
too
her quiet.
much about something.
She just came back.
Yeah.
She had just gotten back from interviewing
Ruby?
Jack Ruby,
Yeah.
and had bragged to several people that she was going to blow this story wide open. And she was found the next day in her bed, sitting up in her clothes and dead. And all her papers and everything were gone, missing. So it was a tragedy.
Well, she had a tie to radio in another way.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, Dick Calmer, was Boston Blackie.
From the radio.
From radio, yeah.
And, of course, doing all those TV shows and stuff like
sure.
that. And she was a fine journalist, really, a good writer.
I said that was going to be one or two of my final questions. Answer me this. Those years you did sports in D.C., am I wrong in saying that it was, in a way, the perfect sports town because you had people from everywhere there?
It was very cosmopolitan. It wasn't the perfect sports town because at that time they were still trying to find a baseball team. They had lost 2. One went to Texas and the other went to Minnesota. We had a bartender in Washington, D.C. named Baseball Bill who made it his life mission to get a baseball team back in Washington, D.C. In fact, when the guy whose name escapes me in our conversation went to Minnesota, he ran for governor. And Baseball Bill went to every bartender in Washington, D.C., me included, and we all chipped in, and we bought a full-page ad in the Minnesota Tribune or whatever, and said this guy is a liar. He said he would never leave, and he took the team, away. If you're going to want to vote for a liar, vote for him. And he wound up losing that election. I don't think that had everything to do with it, but there was. It's a great city, but so is the desert of Southern California for the same thing. That's one of the reasons why I never, even when I did a sports show here in a small market, I never focused on the local stories. I treated it like it was a national show.
You have a very high percentage of well-educated, retirement-age people here who have a little bit of money, as I say, good education, who speak well. And you're right. That's when I listen to your show, those people who are calling in are on the ball.
Well, I treat it as if it's a national show. I mean, for several reasons. One, you never know. Maybe somebody will hear it and it'll be a national show, which is every small market talk show host's dream. And two, because the area is so cosmopolitan. We have people that grew up in Minnesota, in Oregon, Canada, Mexico. So I treat them. I think if you treat your audience as intelligent, you'll have an intelligent audience. That's pretty much that simple. So,
by the way, if you go to the ballpark at Arlington, Texas, there's an annex of the Cooperstown Museum there, and if you look at the uniforms of the Rangers, the first year, you can see stitching that says Senators.
I'm sure, yeah. That's how cheap they were. Bob Short. Bob Short was the guy's name. I believe it was Bob Short that ran for governor or something. And Baseball Bill made it his mission on earth to go get that guy. But I mean, that's a metropolitan city.
Yeah.
And it's so dominated by politics. I was bartending one night. You'll appreciate this story. And every producer and anchor and weatherman and is in my restaurant. And this is the day before cell phones when everybody had beepers. Well, beep beep, heard a beeper go off. Okay, beep beep, another one. Beep beep, beep beep. All 60 beepers went up.
This is like seeing cars in the Pentagon parking lot at night. You know something's up.
So that was the night Marion Barry had his saddest night with the crack pipe.
Yeah, the former D.C. mayor.
So everybody left, and I was stuck with 30 checks sitting on the bar until they cleared the story. So it was a great time. I loved that city. You never know. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, but you have a niche here in Palm Springs.
I like it here.
And what did it feel like the first day you came back on the air and the phones rang off the hook?
Well, I left just about a year ago to go back to Massachusetts. My father was not in good health, and I had hoped to be more of a participating family member in that regard. And then he tragically passed away about 8 hours before the plane landed. And so, it got my trip back there off to a rocky start. It was very hard to find work. And I just, at some point I decided, well, if I don't go back now, I'll never be able to go back. And so it was 6 or 7 months, and I came back, and I was lucky enough to secure a job again and have a couple of different things going on. So,
but as I say, you came back on the air, your old niche in Palm Springs, and the welcome you got on the air was amazing,
really, wasn't
lovely.
it? I'm so happy you said that.
Yeah.
It was amazing. I think, and I've said this before, this is a situation in this particular market, Dennis, where an audience was searching for a show. I mean, it's not just because it's the great, attractive, magnetic personality of Rich Gilgalllon. I wish that it was. But really, the audience was hunting for a show on a local level where people could express themselves about their frustration with the government.
Right, and the word is local. The odds of getting through to Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh on the phone and then being put on the air, you might as well buy a lottery ticket.
Yeah, and I would say to people who are listening, if they own a medium to small market radio station, don't pipe in everything. Mm-hmm. I know that I know it costs a little money to put somebody on the air.
Local is what radio does best.
And
no matter how, in some cases, small town it might seem, by gosh, it's their town.
You're absolutely right. And obviously radio stations are dealing with satellite radio and this and that. The one thing that they'll never be able to replace is local talk. And it's my feeling that at some point, as the satellite market grows, and it's been growing steadily, that at some point local FM music stations won't make that much sense. And so I think that at some point all local FM stations probably will be talk at some point, because you can't replace that. And sponsors will gravitate towards that, and listeners will always want to know what's going on locally. So,
and you do it well.
Thank you, sir. And it's a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you, and thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Anytime.
What a fun and nice guy, Rich Gilgallon, who's one of those people in radio who has worn an awful lot of hats over the years. On this week's American Montage. I hope you enjoyed this interview from my new American Montage series. Check out YouTube for more. I'm Dennis Daly.